My son cut me out of his wedding, and I found out through Facebook photos at 6:12 a.m. There was his wife in white, smiling with her whole family, champagne glasses raised. And there was my checking account showing 36 straight $500 transfers to them, regular as sunrise. Until that morning, my phone felt heavy in my hand, like it weighed 100 pounds. You know that sick feeling when something you can't unsee clicks into place? They didn't just forget me, they replaced me. They also didn't know I keep records. 2 weeks earlier, back up with me for a second, because the way I found out still makes my stomach turn. It was a Tuesday morning in Columbus, Ohio, cold enough that the kitchen floor felt like ice through my socks. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when my phone rang. It was my daughter-in-law, Melissa Turner. She sounded casual, too casual. She said, "Oh, I meant to tell you we already got married yesterday. We only invited special people." Special people. I remember staring at the toaster like it had just insulted me. I asked where my son was. She said he was busy. Then she laughed, like this was no big deal, like she was telling me they'd switched dinner plans. My son, Brian Turner, called later and tried to smooth it over. He said it was just witnesses and nothing personal. His voice had that tight sound it gets when he's lying and hoping I won't push. So I didn't argue. I hung up and sat there. The coffee went cold. The house was quiet in that way that makes your thoughts louder. Here's where the truth did what it always does. It leaked. I opened Facebook, not even looking for anything, just scrolling like people do. And there it was, a whole album. Melissa's parents, her cousins, her sister's kids, a reception table, a cake, matching outfits, everything. I wasn't in a single frame, not one. That's when my chest got hot, like someone poured boiling water inside me. You know that moment when embarrassment turns into clarity? When you stop wondering if you're crazy? They lied. And they didn't even lie well. I'd already bought a pink dress. It was hanging in my closet with the tag still on it. $200, plus shoes I never wore. I had an envelope in my drawer with $1,000 in cash for their gift. I remember thinking I'd give it to them at the rehearsal dinner. Turns out there was no rehearsal dinner for me. That's when my phone rang again. Same day, same afternoon. Melissa's number popped up. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention the wedding. She said, "Hey, the rent's overdue. You forgot to make the transfer." Forgot. I took a breath and said, real calm, "Didn't I warn you I only help special people?" Silence. Then she switched gears fast, calling me second mom and saying I misunderstood. The words were sweet. The timing was ugly. That was the moment I stopped guessing and started counting. Be honest with me for a second. If your adult kid cut you out of their wedding but still expected your money, would you keep paying? Or would you be done? Comment below. I pulled out my checkbook, my statements, everything. I sat at the kitchen table and did the math like I was balancing someone else's life. 36 months of $500 rent, 18 grand, groceries I covered, emergency cash, a car repair, furniture. It kept adding up, $33,400. That wasn't help, that was a subscription. I sat there a long time, just looking at the number. I thought about how often Brian called without asking for money. I couldn't remember the last time. Love shouldn't come with invoices. I let his calls ring after that. All of them. I went for a walk instead, around the block, past houses where people waved at me, like normal neighbors do. I realized my whole schedule had been built around their needs. That ended that day. The next morning, I drove to my local bank branch, the one off High Street where the tellers know my name. I asked for the manager, Mark Klein, and told him I needed to cancel some automatic transfers. He pulled them up on the screen and raised his eyebrows. He asked if I was being pressured. I told him, no, I just stopped pressuring myself. We shut every one of them down. He printed confirmations. I folded them neatly and put them in my purse. My money, my choice, I turned my phone off in the parking lot and sat there for a minute, hands on the steering wheel, breathing. I knew they'd notice fast. I also knew what people do when the money stops. They panic. When I got home, 3 cars were in my driveway. I hadn't invited anyone. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside and heard voices in my living room. Brian, Melissa, and a man I didn't know, flipping through my files like he owned them. That man introduced himself as David Fisher, an attorney. He stuck his hand out and said they were concerned about my well-being. Concerned people don't rifle through your paperwork. They started talking about stress and confusion and how temporary help could protect everyone. There was a folder on my coffee table, power of attorney forms, already filled in, except for my signature. Melissa said, real calm, "It's just until you feel better." That's when she slipped and said, "Everything you have will belong to us anyway. Game over." I told them to get out of my house. I pointed at the door. Brian looked at the floor. The lawyer warned me judges don't like irrational decisions. I said, "Neither do I." They left, slowly, angry, and as their cars pulled out, I realized something else. They weren't worried about my mind. They were worried about my money. You might want to stick with me for what happens next. They didn't come back for a conversation. They came back for control. And you know that feeling when your own front door stops feeling like yours? Yeah, that. Gone. The second their taillights disappeared the day they stormed out, I locked the deadbolt and just stood there in my entryway, listening to my own house settle. The folder they'd left behind was still on my coffee table like a little landmine. One signature, one pen stroke, and my life would have been theirs. That's when I stopped treating this like family drama and started treating it like a threat. I grabbed the folder with 2 fingers, like it was dirty, and I carried it into the kitchen. The forms weren't blank. They were filled in. Names, addresses, even the agent section with Brian's name typed out like it was already decided. And there was that little line near the bottom where I could practically hear the attorney's voice in my head. Asterisk. It's temporary. It's just to help. Asterisk. Temporary my ass. I flipped it over and saw a sticky note on the back in Melissa's handwriting. Bring Mom in to sign as soon as possible. So yeah, that was the plan. I took pictures of everything. Front and back, close-ups of every line that mattered. Then I slid the whole packet into a gallon Ziploc bag, sealed it, and wrote the date on it with a Sharpie like I was bagging evidence. Some people collect photo albums. I collect proof. The phone was back on by then, and it was already vibrating itself off my kitchen counter. Brian called twice, Melissa called once, then an unknown number, then another unknown number. I didn't pick up a single one. You know that look people give you when they're lying straight to your face? They don't have to be in the room. You can hear it in the ring. Around 4:30, I got a text from Brian that said, "Mom, you're being dramatic. Please call me. Thanks for watching." Dramatic is buying a pink dress for a wedding that never included you. Dramatic is hiding a whole ceremony and then billing me like I'm their landlord. Dramatic is showing up with an attorney and pretending it's love. I texted back one line, "Do not come to my house again without my permission." And then I turned the phone face down like I didn't want their words crawling on me. Here's the part I didn't say out loud yet. I was scared. Not the panicky kind, the cold kind. The kind that makes you check your windows twice and keep your purse near you, even in your own kitchen. They had keys. They'd already used them. They'd already crossed the line. So I did what any woman with half a brain and a lot to lose does. I got help. The next morning, I drove back to the bank, same branch off High Street, and asked Mark Klein if he could print me the full transfer history for the past 3 years. He didn't even hesitate. He looked at my face, and I swear something in him clicked. He said, "You okay, ma'am?" I told him, "I'm getting there, but I need everything. Dates, amounts, all of it." He slid the papers across the desk, and it was worse when it was stacked in ink and numbers. 36 $500 transfers like clockwork. Then little add-ons I'd forgotten, about $200 here, $600 there, $1,200 for a couch they needed because theirs was falling apart. My own money, bleeding out in neat little lines. Mark said quietly, "Do you want me to note that you requested to stop these due to concern of undue influence?" My stomach tightened. That phrasing mattered. That was banking language for times someone is pressuring you. Asterisk. I nodded. Yes, please. And right there, at that desk, I asked him to add extra protections. No phone changes without in-person ID. No new linked accounts without a signature in the branch. I had him confirm my online banking email and my security questions. I changed my password sitting in the parking lot afterward, hands shaking just enough that I kept hitting the wrong keys. I wasn't born yesterday. On the way home, I pulled into the Target off Olentangy River Road and bought a little notebook. Not a fancy one, just a plain spiral, the kind you'd send a kid to school with. I labeled the front, Brian, Melissa, date, time, what happened, who said what. Because if they were going to pretend I was confused, I was going to be the most organized, confused woman in Franklin County. When I got home, I noticed something that made my skin go tight. The side gate to my backyard was unlatched. I don't leave it unlatched. I stood there for a second, staring at that little metal latch, and all I could think was, asterisk. They came back. Asterisk. I didn't go inside right away. I walked around the front like I was just checking the mailbox, but my eyes were scanning everything. Windows, door frame, the garage side door. Nothing looked busted, but that doesn't mean anything when someone has keys. So I did something I'd never done in my life. I called a locksmith. His name was Chad, and he showed up in a van with the kind of tools that make you realize how easy it is to get into things. He asked why I needed the locks changed. I didn't give him the whole story. I just said, my son has a key and he doesn't respect boundaries. Chad didn't laugh. He didn't lecture me about family. He just said, okay, let's get you secure. That felt like a small miracle. New deadbolts, new doorknob locks, new garage code. He rekeyed what he could and replaced what he couldn't. I paid him $389.47, tipped him $20, and I kept the receipt. Of course I did. And when he handed me the new keys, I didn't feel guilty. I felt lighter. My house. My rules. By noon, my phone lit up again, Brian. This time, not a text, an actual call. I watched it ring until it stopped. 10 seconds later, another call. Then, Melissa. Then the unknown numbers started again. One voicemail popped up, and I listened with the phone held away from my ear like it might burn me. It was David Fisher's voice, smooth and irritated. He said, "Miss Turner, my clients are concerned about your recent behavior. You're isolating yourself and making impulsive financial decisions. We'd like to schedule a time to discuss solutions before this becomes more formal." More formal, that was a threat. Wrapped in politeness. Delivered like he was doing me a favor. I saved the voicemail. Screenshot. Download. Email to myself. If you ever want to see how fast family turns into clients, cut off the money. That afternoon, I called the one person in Columbus who I knew wouldn't play nice about this. My friend Nancy's husband had used him years ago when his own kids tried to bully him into selling his house. She'd given me the name and said, "Don't wait until they file something." So I didn't. The attorney's name was Thomas Reynolds. Elder law, estate planning, guardianship defense. The whole nasty world I didn't even realize I needed to know existed. His office was downtown, near the courthouse, in a building that smelled like old carpet and expensive coffee. His receptionist was kind, but efficient, and when Thomas came out to meet me, he didn't do that fake smile thing. He sat down, opened a legal pad, and said, "Tell me what happened. Start with the wedding." I told him everything. The special people line, the Facebook photos, the 3-year transfer history, the folder, the sticky note, the voicemail. He didn't gasp. He didn't act shocked. He just kept writing. Then he looked up and said, "They're setting you up for a guardianship petition." Even though my brain already knew it, hearing it out loud made it real. I said, "Can they do that? Just because they're mad I stopped paying them?" Thomas leaned back and said, "People try every day, and the first move is always the same paint you as unstable, isolated, confused, and financially reckless. The second move is paperwork." I slid the Ziploc bag across his desk. He opened it and flipped through the forms. His jaw tightened just a little. He said, "They came into your home with an attorney and pre-filled POA forms. That's coercion." Coercion. Another word that mattered. He asked if Brian had access to my accounts. I told him no, not officially, but he'd been in my house plenty. Thomas nodded like that was still enough risk. He said, "We're going to do 3 things. First, lock down your finances. Second, lock down your property. Third, document every attempt they make." Point is, I finally felt like I wasn't alone in the room. Thomas typed up a letter right there, same day. Official letterhead, my name, Brian and Melissa's names. David Fisher copied. It said they were not to contact me directly, not to enter my property, and any communication had to go through counsel. It also said any further attempt to obtain signatures or access would be treated as harassment and potential elder financial exploitation. That last phrase hit like a hammer. Elder exploitation. I hate that word, elder. It makes me picture someone frail and confused and sitting in a recliner with a blanket. That's not me. I drive myself. I pay my bills. I mow my own lawn when I feel like it. But exploitation? That part was dead on. On the way out, Thomas handed me a folder of my own. Blank incident log sheets. Instructions for freezing credit. A checklist for changing beneficiaries and reviewing my will. Practical. Cold. Exactly what I needed. And then he said something that made my throat close up. He said, "You'd be surprised how often adult children do this. It's not rare." That hurt more than I wanted it to. I drove home and didn't turn on the radio. The silence was better. My mind was already loud enough. When I got back, I noticed a car sitting across the street. Parked too neatly. Engine off. Someone inside. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a neighbor waiting on a kid. But my body didn't buy that. My body said asterisk, pay attention, asterisk. I wrote it down anyway. Make, model, color, time. Some people will call that paranoid. I call it prepared. Around 7:15 p.m., my doorbell camera, yes, I had one, and yes, I was grateful for it. Pinged my phone. Motion detected. Melissa was on my porch. New locks, so she couldn't get in. But she still walked up like she owned the place. She pressed the doorbell, then knocked, then pressed it again like that would change the answer. I didn't open the door. I stood in the hallway where she couldn't see me through the peephole and watched her on my screen. She smiled at the camera. That fake, sweet smile. Then she leaned in and said, "Renate, we need to talk. This is embarrassing." Embarrassing? She tried the handle. It didn't budge. Her smile dropped. Then Brian stepped into frame behind her. He looked tired. Not guilty. Not sorry. Tired like this was all a hassle. He said, "Mom, open the door." Actoral. And you know what? In that moment, I realized how used to my compliance they were. They weren't asking. They were issuing instructions. I spoke through the camera. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I said, "You need to leave. Now." Melissa's eyes flicked to the camera like she'd forgotten it was there. She said, "Are you seriously talking to us through a camera?" I said, "Yes, leave." Brian's face tightened. He said, "You're acting crazy." There it was. The word they were going to build a case on. I said, "Thomas Reynolds will contact you. Don't come back." Melissa laughed one sharp little bark and said, "Who the hell is Thomas Reynolds?" I didn't answer. I just watched them walk off my porch, and I saved the clip. That clip was a gift. After they left, my hands started shaking. Not a lot, just enough to make me sit down on my kitchen stool and breathe like I'd just run upstairs. You ever notice how your body reacts after the danger passes? That's when the fear shows up. I called my sister, Carol Martinez, in Chicago. Carol is 2 years older than me and has always had a talent for saying the thing nobody wants to hear. She picked up on the first ring. I told her what happened. She didn't say, maybe they didn't mean it. She didn't say, but he's your son. She said, about time. That made me blink. She went on, Renate, he hasn't called you to chat in years. He calls to ask for money, and then he disappears. You know it, I know it. I told her about the wedding. Carol went quiet for a second, and then she said, that's low. That's real low. Then she hit me with something that made my skin go cold. She said, you remember Thanksgiving at my place 2 years ago? Melissa was talking about your house like it was already hers. I said, what do you mean? Carol didn't hesitate. She said, when she's gone, we'll knock down that wall and open up the kitchen. When? Not if. When? I stared at my refrigerator like it was about to answer me. They were budgeting my death. Carol told me she'd overheard Brian once joking about how Mom's got plenty saved and how it would all work out. She said it like she'd been carrying that for a while and didn't know how to hand it to me until now. Some people will say I should have known. I didn't want to know. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept my phone on the nightstand and the volume up, and I hated that about myself. I hated that my own kid had turned me into someone who listened for sounds in the dark. Around 2:40 a.m., another unknown number called. I didn't answer, but it left a voicemail. This one wasn't David Fisher. It was Melissa, using a different number, voice syrupy. She said, Renate, we're worried about you. Please stop listening to outsiders. You're not thinking clearly. And outsiders. Like my attorney was a stranger and she was my family. I saved that one too. The next day, Thomas Reynolds called me and said he'd sent the letter by certified mail and email. He told me, do not meet them in person. Do not let them inside. Keep everything. He also told me to pull my credit report and freeze it. So I did. I spent an hour on the phone with the credit bureaus, listening to robot menus, hitting buttons, writing down confirmation numbers. This is what betrayal looks like at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday. That afternoon, I went to a little hardware store near my neighborhood, the kind with dusty aisles and old guys who know exactly where everything is. I bought extra outdoor lights, motion activated, bright enough to make my driveway look like a stadium. The cashier, an older gentleman with a gray mustache, said, you expecting company? I smiled like a normal person. Not the kind I want. I have an eye. Back home, I installed them with a step stool and a screwdriver. My arms were sore by the end, and I didn't care. Because every little click of a screw felt like taking my house back. By Friday, Thomas had gotten a response from David Fisher. It was short. It was smug. Thomas read part of it to me over the phone. They claim you're being influenced by third parties and making irrational decisions that endanger your long-term well-being. Influenced. That's the word they were going to use to flip the story. Not Mom cut us off because we lied and used her. No. They were going to make it sound like I'd been kidnapped by my own common sense. Thomas said, they're setting the narrative. We're going to set ours. He had me start gathering basic life proof. Recent bills paid on time, medication list, doctor contact info, a list of friends I see regularly, normal stuff that shows a judge you're not confused or isolated. Can you believe that? I had to prove I'm me. So I built a binder. Tabs, plastic sleeves, bank statements, the wedding screenshots, the transfer history, the locksmith receipt, the doorbell camera clips, voicemails saved on a thumb drive. It sounds extreme until you've seen what people will do for money. Saturday morning, I went to the salon. Just a basic cut and color. Nothing fancy. But sitting in that chair, hearing normal chatter, smelling shampoo, it reminded me that my life is bigger than them. Melissa didn't get to ruin my whole world. When I walked out, my phone buzzed. One new email. It was from the Franklin County Probate Court's automated system. Subject line: Notice of filing guardianship. I stared at it so hard my eyes started to burn. And right then, standing in the salon parking lot with my hair still smelling like chemicals and conditioner, I realized the truth. They weren't trying to get my forgiveness. They were trying to get a judge. Lights out. You're going to want to hear what I did next. The first thing I did after that court email was call Thomas Reynolds. And you should have heard how fast his voice changed. You know that tight, no-nonsense tone people get when the fun is over? That, he said, Renate, don't delete anything. Don't respond to them. And if they show up, you do not engage. You call me and you call the police. Simple, clear, cold. Not today. Within an hour, Thomas forwarded me the filing details. Franklin County Probate Court. A case number. Brian and Melissa listed as interested parties. David Fisher as their attorney. And the little phrase that made my throat go dry: emergency guardianship requested. Emergency. Like I was wandering the streets in my pajamas, forgetting my name. Meanwhile, my dishwasher was running, and my bills were paid, and my hair still looked decent from the salon. That's what made it so insulting. They weren't reacting to a crisis. They were creating one. Thomas told me to print everything and bring it to his office that afternoon. I sat at my desk and hit print until my printer started whining like it was personally offended. Email, notice, court header, timestamp. Then I opened a fresh folder on my laptop and labeled it Court. I'd love to tell you I felt brave the whole time. I didn't. My hands were shaky, and I kept rereading the same line, like it might change if I stared hard enough. But fear doesn't get the last word in my house. I drove downtown with my binder on the passenger seat like it was a fragile pet. The courthouse wasn't even where I had to go yet, but just being in that part of town made everything feel official. Like this wasn't just my son being a brat anymore. This was paperwork with teeth. Thomas met me in his conference room and spread my documents out like a crime scene map. He had the bank transfers in one stack, the wedding screenshots in another, and the doorbell footage notes right in front of him. He tapped the Ziploc bag with the power of attorney packet and said, "This is your first big receipt. Receipt. Proof. Whatever you want to call it, it was the kind of thing a judge can't ignore." Then he asked me, "Have they been coming by the house?" I told him about the porch visit and the unknown numbers. And before I could even finish the sentence, he slid a legal pad over to me and said, "Start logging every drive-by too. Dates, times, anything." Drive-bys. That sounded dramatic. And then it immediately stopped sounding dramatic, because when I got home, there was a dark SUV rolling slow past my house. Not the mailman slow. Not the neighbor looking for an address slow. Slow like someone was checking if I was alone. It kept going. 10 minutes later, it came back the other way. I wrote it down. Time, color, plate, state. I wasn't playing detective for fun. I was building a timeline. And here's the thing. Once you start watching, you start seeing. The next day, there was a white sedan parked on the corner by the stop sign for almost 30 minutes. I couldn't see the driver's face. The windows were tinted. It finally pulled off when my neighbor's kid came outside with a trash bag. Then, around lunchtime, my Ring camera picked up motion at the front walkway again. This time, it wasn't just Brian and Melissa. They brought reinforcements. Brian was in front, shoulders tight, trying to look like the reasonable one. Melissa was behind him with her chin up, like she was walking into a customer service counter to demand a manager. And trailing them was David Fisher, holding a folder like it was a weapon, plus a man I didn't recognize mid-40 seconds, baseball cap, arms crossed, the kind of guy who thinks he looks intimidating just by standing still. My stomach flipped. You'd feel it too. Don't pretend you wouldn't. I didn't open the door. I didn't even walk toward it. I called Thomas with my phone pressed to my ear and whispered, "They're here," and they brought people. Thomas didn't ask questions. He said, "Stay inside. Stay away from windows. I'm calling the non-emergency line right now." That's when I realized something. I wasn't dealing with family anymore. I was dealing with trespassers. I watched them through the camera feed. Brian knocked. Melissa knocked harder. David Fisher didn't knock. He just stood there and stared at my door like he expected it to obey him. Melissa finally snapped and shouted, "Renate, open up. This is ridiculous." And then she did the dumbest thing possible. She tried the handle again. New lock, no entry. Her face changed when it didn't give. That mask slipped just enough for the camera to catch it. Not concern. Annoyance. Like a thief finding out the window's bolted. That clip went into my court folder so fast. A few minutes later, the man in the baseball cap walked down my driveway and started peering toward my side yard like he was checking the gate. I felt my pulse in my throat. I didn't know if he was curious or if he was about to try something. Some people say cameras are paranoid. I say cameras are honest. The police showed up in 2 cruisers, lights off but presence loud. One officer walked up to my porch while the other hung back with his hand resting near his belt. They talked to Brian first, then David Fisher, then Melissa. I didn't hear everything they said, but I watched body language like it was subtitles. Melissa's hands were flying. Brian kept pointing at my door. David Fisher held his folder out like it was a permission slip from God. And then the officer shook his head. He pointed to the sidewalk. "Leave." Brian turned and looked straight at my camera. I swear he wanted me to flinch. He wanted me to come out and argue so they could call it erratic. I stayed inside. He yelled, "You can't call the cops on your own, son." And I couldn't help it. I spoke through the camera loud enough for everyone to hear. I said, "Family doesn't threaten guardianship to get money." Silence. That line landed right on the porch boards and just sat there. The officer told them again to leave the property. The man in the baseball cap muttered something and walked back toward the street. Melissa looked like she wanted to scream. David Fisher's face stayed stiff, but his eyes were sharp, like he was already planning the next move. Brian didn't look angry anymore. He looked embarrassed. Good. They finally got in their cars and drove off, and my whole body went tight and shaky the second the danger pulled away. That's how it goes. You hold it together until you're safe, then you feel it. I opened my door just enough to speak to the officer. He asked if I wanted to file a report for trespassing. I said yes. Calm voice, steady eyes. Because paper beats panic. He took my statement on the porch, pen scratching on his little notepad. He asked if they had keys. I told him I changed the locks. He asked if I had prior documentation. I told him my attorney did. The officer gave me a card with a report number written on the back. I put that card in my binder. Right behind the bank statements. Same pocket. That night, Thomas called and said, "I'm filing for a temporary restraining order first thing tomorrow. A restraining order against my own son." That sentence tastes awful, even when it's the right sentence. Look, I know how this sounds to people who still believe family is family, but would you have let them keep showing up like that? Would you have waited until they broke something, or hurt someone, or trapped you into signing? I wasn't waiting. The next morning, Thomas filed the paperwork and gave me copies stamped by the clerk. He told me to keep one in my car, one in my kitchen drawer, and one in the binder. He also reminded me not to post anything online, not to text them, not to give them anything they could twist into unstable. So I did the most boring, responsible thing possible. I lived my life like a normal adult, and I documented theirs like a problem. A couple days later, my neighbor Eleanor Brooks came over with a plate of cookies. She's in her 60 seconds too, the kind of woman who knows everyone's business without acting like she does. She stood on my porch and said, quietly, "I heard raised voices the other day. Are you okay?" I looked at her and almost cried, which annoyed me. I'm not a crier, not in front of people. But Eleanor didn't push. She just handed me the plate and said, "If you need someone to sit with you, you call me." That's how real support looks. Not a folder and a threat, a plate and a phone number. A week later, she invited me to dinner at her place. Nothing fancy. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans. Her sister stopped by, and two of her friends from church. They talked about normal stuff, grandkids, gas prices, the best Kroger coupons, like that's the national sport. And sitting at that table, I realized something that made my throat ache. I had been starving for ordinary because my life with Brian and Melissa was always a crisis, always an emergency, always a new bill, a new drama, a new reason I had to rescue them. Eleanor's house felt like oxygen. On my way home, my phone buzzed with a missed call from an unknown number. Then another. Then a voicemail. This one wasn't sweet. This one was sharp. Melissa's voice said, "You're making this so much worse for yourself. You're going to end up alone." There it was again. The loneliness threat, like it was a weapon. I saved it, logged it, date and time. Then I went inside, locked my door, and turned my porch light on just because I felt like it. Some people say I went too far. I say I finally went far enough. 2 mornings later, at 9:08 a.m., my doorbell rang, and the camera picked up a woman standing on my porch with a clipboard and a badge. Adult Protective Services. APS. She held up her ID to the camera like she'd done this 1,000 times. She looked polite, but firm, like she already had a story in her head. I opened the door with the chain still on and said, "Can I help you?" She introduced herself as Susan Schmidt. She said she needed to do a wellness check because they'd gotten a report that I was at risk, possibly confused, and isolated. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I asked for her ID again and read it carefully. Susan didn't love that. I could tell. But she handed it over. Then she hit me with that little line people use when they want you to surrender your boundaries. She said, "If you have nothing to hide, this should be quick." That line makes my skin crawl. It's always a trap. I said, "I'm calling my attorney." Susan's eyes flicked. Just for a second. Annoyance. Like I wasn't cooperating the way her script expected. I called Thomas on speaker and said, "APS is here." Thomas said, "Put me on." Susan tried to talk over him. He didn't let her. He asked for her full name, badge number, and the nature of the allegation. He also told her, politely but firmly, that any interview would happen with him present. Susan sighed like this was inconvenient. Good. While we waited for Thomas to drive over, Susan asked me questions in my living room. She looked around while she spoke at my furniture, at my family photos, at my kitchen, like she was cataloging my life. She asked if I cooked. I said yes. She asked if I drove. I said yes. She asked about medications. I told her the truth. Blood pressure meds. Nothing wild. She asked about my paranoia and gestured vaguely toward my doorbell camera. I said, "Cameras don't mean dementia." 8. That made her lips press together. Susan asked if I'd been giving money to my son. I said, "I used to." I stopped. And then she asked why, like she didn't already know. So I showed her. I pulled my binder out like it was a holy book and opened it right on my coffee table. Wedding photos, transfer history, the sticky note on the POA packet, doorbell footage, timestamps, voicemails saved. Susan's eyes moved fast. She was reading, but she was also recalculating. When Thomas arrived, he walked in, calm, suit jacket on, legal pad in hand. He shook Susan's hand like he'd met 100 Susans. He said, "This looks like elder financial exploitation and coercion, not incapacity." Susan blinked. Just once. But I saw it, because the story in her head had changed. Thomas asked her if APS was aware there was an active probate filing initiated by the parties who were financially dependent on me. He asked if she'd been told they showed up at my home with an attorney and tried to get me to sign documents. He asked if she'd been told the police had just removed them from my property. Susan looked uncomfortable now. Not angry, uncomfortable. She admitted she hadn't been given all those details. She said she'd received a report about sudden financial changes, erratic behavior, and isolation. Sudden financial changes? You mean I stopped paying their rent? Thomas asked her, did the reporter mention the wedding exclusion? Susan paused. No. So I slid my phone over with the Facebook album open. Timestamp. Faces. A whole family celebrating without me. Susan stared at it for a long second. Then she looked up and said, okay, just one word. Okay. That word meant she was finally seeing what you're seeing. Susan finished her checklist anyway. She asked if I had friends. Eleanor's name went down. Carol's name went down. Thomas's name went down. She asked if I was afraid of my son and daughter-in-law. I didn't sugarcoat it. I said, yes, because they're trying to take my rights. Susan wrote that down. And when she stood up to leave, she didn't give me a lecture. She didn't scold me for boundaries. She didn't tell me to reconcile. She said, you did the right thing by calling your attorney. Vindicated. After she left, I watched her walk down my driveway and get in her car. Then I turned to Thomas and said, so what now? Thomas didn't hesitate. He said, now we assume they're going to escalate because their other tricks didn't work. My stomach tightened. He opened his folder and showed me a printed copy of the probate notice again, and he tapped it with his finger. He said, this is the opening move. The next move is the real fight. Then he looked me dead in the eyes and said, they can file for full guardianship, and they might do it fast. End quote. Worse than I thought. Lights out. You're going to want to hear what landed in my mailbox after that. That probate notice wasn't just paper. It was a leash, and they were already trying to snap it around my neck. You can feel that kind of threat in your bones, right? I called Thomas Reynolds the second I got home, still sitting in my car in the driveway with the engine running like I didn't trust my own house to be quiet. He said, they're going to try to make this look urgent. We're going to make it look true. True is a stronger weapon than loud. Within 24 hours, a process server showed up at my door. Not a cop, not a neighbor. A man in a windbreaker holding an envelope like it was a pizza delivery. Except this one was trying to ruin my life. He asked, Renate Turner? I said, yes. He handed me the packet and walked away without looking back. That's how casually the world can change. The cover page said, Franklin County Probate Court, and under petitioners, there were my son and daughter-in-law, Brian Turner, Melissa Turner. Right next to their names, it listed what they wanted. Guardianship of my person and my estate. My person, my estate. My rights? I sat at my kitchen table and read their allegations line by line. And I'm telling you, it felt like reading a stranger's fan fiction about my life. They wrote that I was confused, that I was isolating, that I was unable to manage my finances, that I was being influenced by outsiders. They claimed I'd become paranoid and aggressive, and they tossed in the word dementia like it was seasoning. And the thing that made my hands go cold was this. They weren't just asking the court to protect me. They were asking the court to hand me over. Some people will hear that and think, well, if you have nothing to hide, you'll be fine. And I'm here to tell you that's not how it works when the other side is willing to lie with a straight face. A lie in a court file is still a lie, but it can rent space in a judge's head. Thomas had me drive to his office immediately with the whole packet. I brought my binder too, because at that point it felt like the only thing standing between me and a nightmare. His receptionist didn't smile this time. She just took one look at the stack of papers and said, he's ready for you. Thomas sat me down and read their petition quietly, lips tight, pen tapping against the margin. Every so often he'd circle a sentence and write a little note. Then he set it down and said, they're overreaching. That's good for us. Good? I asked. He nodded. Because it shows motive. They're not just trying to help. They're trying to take everything. We can prove that. I wanted to believe him. I did. But when someone sues for your independence, your body doesn't just relax, Because your lawyer says the word motive. It stays on alert. Thomas flipped to the section listing witnesses. That's where the next punch came from. They had 3 people lined up to swear I was losing it. One was Melissa's mother, Denise Carter. Of course, one was a neighbor I barely knew, a man named Paul Dwyer, who'd moved in down the street last year. I'd waved at him twice. That was it. And the third was a care provider named Tanya Mills. I stared at that name like it might explain itself. I said, I don't have a care provider. Thomas looked at me and said, then we find out who she is. So that was the plan. While they built a story out of strangers, I was going to build the truth out of documents. The court set a preliminary hearing date fast. 10 days. That's how emergency works. You don't get months to breathe. You get a countdown. 10 days to keep my life. Thomas told me, we need a capacity evaluation from your doctor, current and clean. We need financial competency proof, and we need to attack their witnesses. Attack is a harsh word, but in court, it's basically the job description. The next morning, I went to my primary care doctor, Dr. Andrew Patel, over on Bethel Road. I've been seeing him for years. He knows my history. He knows my blood pressure's a little stubborn, and my cholesterol likes to act up, but he also knows I'm not confused. The waiting room was packed the way it always is. A crying toddler, an older man coughing into his sleeve, daytime TV murmuring in the corner. Normal life going on while my own life was on the chopping block. When the nurse called me back, she asked what I was there for. I told her the truth. I need documentation that I'm mentally competent. My son filed for guardianship. Her eyes widened. She said, oh my gosh. And then she got very professional, very fast. Clipboard, vitals, questions. Dr. Patel came in and shut the door behind him. He sat down and said, okay, tell me what's happening. So I did. The wedding, the money, the threats, the porch visit, the police, APS. He listened without interrupting. And when I finished, he said, this is financial coercion. Hearing that again from a doctor, someone who doesn't have a personal stake, felt like oxygen, not comfort, validation. He ran a cognitive screening right there. Simple stuff. Date, time, recall, problem solving. I answered everything without blinking, mostly because I was angry enough to power a small city. At the end, he said, you're fine. You're upset, and you have every reason to be upset. He printed a letter on clinic letterhead stating I was alert, oriented, competent to make medical and financial decisions with no evidence of cognitive impairment. He signed it with a flourish, like he wanted his signature to carry weight. And it did. I walked out of that office holding that letter like it was a shield. Don't play with me. Next stop was the bank. Because Thomas wanted more than transfer history. He wanted a pattern of me paying my own bills on time. Utility payments, mortgage, insurance, everything. I met Mark Klein again, and when I told him the court filing had moved to emergency guardianship, his face hardened. He said, I can prepare an account management summary. It'll show regular bill pay, account stability, no overdrafts. He printed it, stamped it, and included a note that I had personally requested fraud prevention measures due to concern of undue influence from family. He didn't have to do that. He chose to. Sometimes strangers show up better than blood. By day 3, my binder had grown into a monster. Capacity letter, bank summary, police report number, APS notes, doorbell footage stills, voicemail transcripts. Screenshots of those wedding photos. That sticky note that said, bring mom in to sign as soon as possible. If anyone was confused, it wasn't me. But then the other side landed their first real hit. Thomas called me at 8:11 a.m. and said they filed an emergency motion asking the court to appoint a temporary guardian pending the hearing. Temporary guardian. That means someone could legally step into my life before I even got to speak. My stomach tightened so hard, I had to sit down on the edge of my bed. I looked at my bedroom, the quilt my mother made, the little lamp I've had forever, and all I could think was, asterisk. What if they walk in here and tell me I can't live my own life anymore? Asterisk. That's the kind of fear that doesn't feel dramatic. It feels practical. Thomas said, "We're going to oppose it today, but I need you ready for a home visit from the court investigator." Home visit. So I cleaned like the FBI was coming. Not because my house was dirty, but because I refused to let them point to a pile of laundry and call it decline. I vacuumed. I wiped counters. I lined up my medication bottles neatly. I made sure there was food in the fridge. I even took out the trash early. And yes, I know how that sounds. Like I'm trying to prove I deserve my own life. That's exactly what it is. The investigator came that afternoon. Her name was Linda Reese. She wore a blazer and sensible shoes, and she had that calm, trained face people get when they've seen too much. She sat on my couch with her clipboard and said, "I need to ask you some questions." I told her, "Ask." She asked about my daily routine. I told her. Coffee, errands, church some Sundays, dinner with Eleanor sometimes, calls with my sister Carol. She asked if I drove. I told her yes and pointed out my car keys sitting on the kitchen counter like normal. She asked about my finances. I slid the bank summary across the coffee table and said, "I manage them fine. Here's the proof." Linda looked through it, and I could see her posture shift. She wasn't expecting organized. She wasn't expecting receipts. She was expecting a mess she could quietly label. Then she asked, "Why do you think your son filed this?" I didn't get poetic. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just said, "Because I stopped paying their bills." Linda's pen paused. She looked up. "They were financially dependent on you?" I nodded. 3 years of $500 transfers, 36 months, and they got married without me. Then they showed up with pre-filled documents for me to sign. I handed her the photos of the paperwork, the sticky note, the ring footage still where Melissa's hand was on my doorknob. Linda stared at it, and her mouth tightened. I watched her face and thought, asterisk, good, see it. Before she left, she asked if Brian and Melissa could come to the house to talk. It wasn't a suggestion from her. It was a probe. Would I cave? Would I fold? I said no, and they've been trespassed. It's in the police report. Linda nodded slowly and wrote something down. Then she stood and said, "The court will review everything." When the door closed behind her, I leaned my head back against the wall and exhaled. My hands were shaking again. Not because I was weak, because the stakes were insane. Who sues their mom for control? 2 days later, Thomas got the witness disclosures from David Fisher. That's where the next twist hit. Tanya Mills, the care provider, wasn't a nurse. She wasn't a home health aide. She wasn't anything official. Thomas had his paralegal look her up, and there was no license tied to that name. No employer record, no certification, nothing. A ghost witness. Thomas called me and said, "They're padding the file with credibility. We can challenge that." For the first time in days, I felt something like hope. It wasn't warm. It was sharp, like a blade. Then the near defeat rolled in right behind it, because life likes to double tap. That evening, around 6:50 p.m., my phone blew up with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Old neighbors, distant cousins, someone from church I barely talked to. They all said some version of the same thing. "Are you okay? I heard you're not doing well. I heard your family is worried." Melissa had started a smear campaign. She posted on Facebook public about our family navigating dementia and protecting loved ones who don't understand. She didn't use my name, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew. She even had the nerve to add, "Please pray for us. This is heartbreaking." Heartbreaking. Like she was the victim of my boundaries. Eleanor called me and said, "Honey, I saw something online. Do you want me to say anything?" I told her no. We don't fight this in the comments. We fight it in court. Paper beats posts. But I'll be honest with you. That smear hit me harder than the court filing for about 5 minutes. Because it wasn't just legal. It was social. She was trying to make me look pathetic in front of my community. And for a second, I had that old reflex explain myself. Smooth it over, keep the peace. Then I remembered the wedding photos. Peace with them is just surrender. Thomas advised me not to respond publicly, but he did tell me to capture everything. So I screenshotted her post, the comments, the date and time. I saved it all in my folder. Let her talk. She's writing her own evidence. The preliminary hearing was on a Monday morning. I dressed like I was going to a job interview. Navy blazer, simple necklace, nothing flashy, nothing soft. I wanted the judge to see a woman who runs her own life, not a person who needs permission to breathe. Thomas met me outside the courthouse downtown. The air was cold, and the steps were crowded with people coming in for everything from traffic court to custody fights. You could feel the stress in the place like static. We went through security, metal detector, trays, a deputy waving us through. Normal process for an abnormal situation. In the hallway, outside the courtroom, I saw them. Brian was standing with his hands in his pockets, jaw clenched. Melissa was beside him, wearing a beige sweater like she was trying to look wholesome. David Fisher stood a step behind them, folder tucked under his arm. And then I saw Denise Carter, Melissa's mother, holding Melissa's hand like they were about to go on stage. Brian looked at me, and for a split second I saw something flicker in his face. Not remorse, calculation. Melissa stepped forward and hissed, "You didn't have to do all this." I almost laughed. Almost. Thomas stepped between us and said, "You don't speak to her. You speak to me." Melissa's cheeks went red. She looked past Thomas and said to me, "You're letting strangers turn you against your own son." I said one sentence, quiet and steady. "You tried to take my signature like it was your property." Brian's eyes dropped. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't need volume. We went into the courtroom. Wood benches, flags, the judge's seal, that heavy air that makes everyone whisper, even when they're angry. The judge was an older man, Judge Harold Bennett, glasses low on his nose. He looked tired, in the way only people who've seen too many lies can look tired. David Fisher started first. He painted a picture of me as a confused widow with recent decline, financial mismanagement, and paranoid behavior. He used the words sudden and erratic, like he'd practiced them in the mirror. He requested temporary guardianship pending a full evaluation. Then Thomas stood up and did something I'll never forget. He didn't argue feelings. He argued facts. He handed up Dr. Patel's capacity letter. He handed up the bank summary. He referenced the police report number from the trespass call. He mentioned the APS visit and the investigator notes. He showed the court photos of the pre-filled power of attorney documents and that sticky note. He said, "Your Honor, this is not incapacity. This is retaliation. They were financially dependent on Miss Turner. She stopped funding them. They escalated to coercion and now legal control." Judge Bennett looked down at the paperwork, then looked directly at Brian. He asked, "Mr. Turner, how much money have you received from your mother in the last 3 years?" Brian's mouth opened, closed. Then he glanced at David Fisher like a kid looking for a lifeline. David said, "Your Honor, we don't have that number prepared." Judge Bennett didn't like that. He said, "You filed an emergency petition, but you don't have basic financial details?" David tried to recover. "We can provide it." Judge Bennett said, "You will." That moment right there, that was the first crack. Still, it didn't mean I'd won. Not yet. Judge Bennett ordered a full evaluation and set dates. He didn't grant temporary guardianship that day, which felt like someone pulled me back from a cliff by the collar. But he didn't dismiss the case either. He said, "We'll proceed with investigation. This is a serious matter." Serious matter. Walking out of that courtroom, I didn't feel victorious. I felt like I'd survived the first wave. Melissa caught up to me in the hallway while Thomas was speaking with the clerk. She leaned in and said, "You think you're safe? You're not. Thanks for watching." Then she smiled like she'd said something clever. Brian stood behind her and didn't stop her. That's what gutted me. Not her mouth. His silence. I looked at them both and said, "Threats look real pretty on a court transcript." She blinked. Brian's face tightened. And that's when David Fisher stepped closer and said, "Lo, please don't make this harder than it needs to be." I stared at him and thought, asterisk. Harder for who? Asterisk. On the drive home, my phone buzzed with an email from Thomas. Subject line, discovery request, new information. New information is never cute. When I opened it, my throat went dry. Thomas's investigator had found out who Paul Dwyer really was. He wasn't just a neighbor. He had prior fraud charges in another county and had been connected to Melissa's uncle through some side business. Not close enough to scream conspiracy on its own, but close enough to smell bad. And then there was Tanya Mills, the care provider. Thomas had pulled her address from their filing. It matched a rental mailbox, a UPS store box, a fake witness with a rented address. That's when my fear flipped into something else. Anger, sure, but also focus. Because if they were willing to forge credibility, they were sloppy enough to get caught. Thomas called me and said, "Renate, this is the weapon." Weapon, a simple word. A heavy truth. He said, if we can show the court they fabricated witnesses, the whole petition collapses. It won't just be denied. It'll backfire. Backfire sounded good, but it also sounded dangerous. Because people who lie like this don't stop when you corner them. And as if the universe wanted to prove that point, my Ring camera pinged right then. Motion detected. Someone was at my front door, holding a new envelope. Certified mail. I watched through the app as the person slid it into my mailbox and walked away fast. I didn't even open my door. I waited until they were gone, then walked to the mailbox like it might bite me. Inside was a thick packet from David Fisher's office. On top, one line was highlighted in yellow. Notice of intent to seek emergency appointment. They were trying again. Lights out. Stay with me, because this is where I stop playing defense. That highlighted intent letter didn't scare me anymore. It just told me they were desperate. And you can hear desperation through paper, can't you? Fine. If they wanted emergency, I was going to give them emergency, just not the kind they were expecting. Thomas Reynolds had me in his office the next morning at 8 sharp. He didn't offer coffee. He didn't waste words. He slid a new stack of documents across the table and said, "We're filing our own emergency motion." That got my attention. He pointed to the top page. Motion to dismiss for fraud upon the court. Fraud. That word tastes different than family conflict. That word makes judges sit up straighter. Thomas had photos printed out of the Tanya Mills address UPS store mailbox rental. He had a public record printout on Paul Dwyer's prior fraud charge and the connection to Melissa's extended family. He had a sworn statement template for Eleanor Brooks, my neighbor, plus a statement from my sister, Carol Martinez. He had the bank manager's note about undue influence. He had my doctor's letter. He had the trespass report. He had the APS workers' notes. And then he tapped the thickest section screenshots of Melissa's Facebook posts. He said, she did us a favor. She turned her smear campaign into evidence. Big mistake. Thomas told me to expect a response from David Fisher that would try to spin everything into protecting a vulnerable parent. He also told me something that made my stomach clench. He said, if they're bold enough to file fake witnesses, they're bold enough to lie on the stand. End quote. So I went home and did the one thing that kept me calm. I kept building my wall. I changed the beneficiaries on everything that mattered. Life insurance, retirement, bank accounts, not in a revenge way, in a reality way. I wasn't going to let them win by paperwork if they couldn't win by court. Then I drove to the county clerk's office and pulled certified copies of my own basic records. Deed, mortgage, a clean ownership trail. I wanted my property history in black and white, with stamps, because stamps make liars nervous. By lunchtime, I had new motion lights installed in the back too, the kind that turn your yard into daylight the second something moves. A neighbor might call it extra. I call it preventive. My phone stayed quiet for almost a whole day after that, which sounds like peace, but it isn't. It's the quiet before someone tries something stupid. And sure enough, at 9:17 p.m. that night, my Ring camera caught Brian's car creeping past my house with its headlights off. Not parked, not stopping, just rolling. I saved the clip, logged it. Timestamp, plate visible. Then, like he couldn't resist, a text came through from Brian. Not an apology, not a question, a demand. He wrote, "Stop this. You're humiliating us." Humiliating. That word almost made me laugh, because the audacity was wild. They filed to take my rights, called the state on me, told the neighborhood I was losing my mind, and now they were worried about embarrassment. I didn't answer. Silence is a boundary, too. 2 days later, Thomas forwarded me David Fisher's response. It was a long email, full of phrases like best interests and safety concerns. And buried right in the middle was the line that told me exactly what they were really mad about. David wrote, "Miss, Turner's sudden refusal to provide financial support has placed undue hardship on the petitioners." There it was. They put their motive in writing like a confession. Thomas called and said, "We're printing that in 48-point font for the judge." You know those moments where you feel the power shift? That was one. The final hearing date came fast. The court moved quicker than I expected once fraud got mentioned. A new date. A longer time slot. Evidentiary hearing printed at the top. The night before, I didn't sleep much. Not because I thought I'd lose, because my body was still catching up to how insane it was to have to defend my own competence like I was on trial for being alive. So I did what I always do when I can't sleep. I made a list. What I had. What they didn't. What I wouldn't give up. At 6:30 a.m., I showered, put on a clean blouse, and pinned my hair back. I wasn't dressing to impress. I was dressing to be taken seriously. I packed my binder, my thumb drive, and a printed timeline with dates and receipts. Then I sat at my kitchen table and ate a piece of toast I couldn't taste. You don't realize how much your mouth dries out until you're walking into a courtroom to keep your freedom. Thomas met me outside the courthouse again. Downtown Columbus. Gray sky. Cold air. People smoking near the entrance like they were trying to burn off nerves. He looked at me and said, "Today, we stay calm. We let them hang themselves." That's what he said, straight-faced, like this was just another Tuesday for him. For me, it felt like stepping into a storm. Inside the hallway, I saw Melissa first. She was in a blazer this time, hair smooth, makeup perfect. She looked like she'd studied Concerned Daughter-in-Law on YouTube. Denise Carter was beside her again, holding her purse like a shield. Brian stood a few steps back, eyes darting, like he didn't want to be recognized. David Fisher was there too, but his posture was different than last time. He still had his folder, but he wasn't smug anymore. He looked wary. Good. Melissa spotted me and whispered something to Brian. Brian's shoulders went up. He walked toward me, stopping just out of Thomas's reach like he wanted to speak to me directly. He said, "Mom, please, just sign the agreement and we'll end this." Agreement. Thomas stepped forward and said, "No direct contact." Brian's face tightened. He looked at me anyway, like I'd cave if he stared hard enough. I said, "You didn't want me at your wedding. You don't get me in your courtroom either." That landed. Brian flinched like I slapped him. Melissa's eyes narrowed. She said, "This isn't about a wedding." And I said, quiet as a knife, "It's about money." Then the courtroom doors opened and everyone moved like cattle into the benches. Judge Harold Bennett came in, robe swaying, face set. He looked down at his file for a long moment before he even spoke. And the first thing he said was, "We are here on a petition for guardianship and a motion alleging fraud. That is not a small accusation." His eyes went to David Fisher. He said, "Counsel, you understand the seriousness?" David stood. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Bennett nodded once. "Proceed." David started with their story again. He talked about concerns and decline and isolation. He pointed to the bank transfers, stopping like it was evidence of my instability, not evidence of me gaining common sense. He introduced Denise Carter as a witness. Denise took the stand first. She clutched her purse in her lap and gave the judge a sad face, like she was auditioning for a commercial. She said Melissa was heartbroken and that I'd been acting strange. She said I was confused about family events and forgetful, and quired. Thomas waited until she'd finished her little performance, then stood up and asked, "Miss Carter, were you present at the wedding?" Denise blinked. "Yes." Thomas nodded. "Did you see Renate Turner there?" Denise hesitated. "No." Thomas asked, "Was she invited?" Denise glanced at Melissa. "I don't know." Thomas didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He said, "You don't know if your daughter-in-law's mother-in-law was invited to the wedding you attended?" Denise's cheeks went pink. "Well, it was small." Thomas pulled out the printed Facebook photos. He approached the witness box and handed them over. He said, "Is this small?" Denise stared at the photos like they were radioactive. I saw my own absence right there again, like a bruise. Thomas asked, "How many guests were there?" Denise mumbled, "I didn't count." Thomas turned one page and pointed. "Are these place settings?" Denise swallowed. "Yes." Thomas said, "Were there gifts?" Denise said, "Yes." End quote. Thomas asked, "Was there a reception?" Denise said, "Yes." Thomas nodded and then asked the question that made the room go quiet. He said, "So the person you're claiming is confused and unstable was excluded from a full event, and then within days your daughter-in-law demanded rent money, correct?" Denise's mouth opened, closed. She said, "I don't know about money." Thomas smiled, but it wasn't friendly. He said, "Of course you don't." Denise stepped down looking rattled. Not devastated, not concerned. Rattled, like she hadn't expected to be challenged. Next up, they called Paul Dwyer. Paul walked to the witness stand like he owned the place. Baseball cap gone, collared shirt on, face hard. He swore in and sat down, arms folded. He said he'd seen me yelling at strangers and acting paranoid. He said he'd seen me refuse help and lash out. Thomas stood and asked, "Mr. Dwyer, how long have you lived in Miss Pont?" "Turner's neighborhood?" Paul said, "About a year." Thomas asked, "How many times have you spoken with Miss Turner?" Paul shrugged. "A few." Thomas asked, "Define a few." Paul's jaw tightened. "I don't know. 3? 4? Thomas nodded. "So your opinion that she's incapacitated is based on 3 or 4 interactions." Paul said, "I know what I saw." Thomas pulled out his next page and said, "You know what I saw, Mr. Dwyer?" Paul stared. Thomas said, "I saw your prior fraud charge." End quote. The air in the courtroom changed. Even the clerk looked up. Paul's face went stiff. "That's not relevant." Thomas said, "It's relevant to credibility. And Your Honor, we have certified records." Judge Bennett leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Dwyer, you will answer." Paul looked at David Fisher. David's eyes flicked away. That was the moment I knew David hadn't vetted his own witness. Or he had and he thought the judge wouldn't care. Bad gamble. Thomas asked, "Were you convicted?" Paul snapped, "It was dismissed." Thomas said, "It was reduced, not dismissed." Paul's nostrils flared. "Whatever." Judge Bennett's voice got sharper. "Watch your tone." Thomas didn't even smile. He just kept going. He asked, "Are you related to Denise Carter?" Paul said no. Thomas asked, "Do you know Melissa Turner's uncle, Rick Carter?" Paul hesitated. "Maybe." Thomas said, "Maybe?" Paul said, "I've met him." "If it wying ever?" Thomas asked. "Through what?" Paul swallowed. "Business." Thomas nodded like he'd expected it. "What business?" Paul's face hardened. "That's private." Thomas turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this witness has a direct connection to the petitioner's family through financial dealings, and he has a fraud history. His testimony should be weighed accordingly." Judge Bennett wrote something down. Paul stepped down looking angry, not righteous. Then David Fisher called Tanya Mills. And that's where everything cracked wide open. Tanya walked in late, like she'd just been pulled from somewhere else. She wore scrubs, which would have looked convincing if they'd been clean. They weren't. She kept tugging at the sleeves like she wasn't used to wearing them. She swore in and said she was my care provider. Thomas stood up and asked, "Miss Mills, where do you provide care for Miss Turner?" Tanya said, "At her home." Thomas asked, "How often?" Tanya said, "A few times a week." End quote. In Once the Apple, Thomas asked, "For how long?" Tanya paused. "A while." Thomas asked, "What is a while?" Tanya blinked fast. "Months." Thomas nodded and said, "Okay, let's start simple. What color is Miss Turner's front door?" Tanya froze. "My front door is a deep red, always has been." Tanya guessed white. Thomas didn't react. He just asked, "How many steps lead up to the porch?" Tanya swallowed. 2. "It's 4. Thomas asked, "Where's the mailbox?" Tanya stared at him like he was speaking another language. "On the door?" I heard someone in the back row suck in a breath. Thomas turned to the judge and said, "Your Honor, may I approach with exhibits?" Judge Bennett nodded. Thomas handed Tanya a still photo from my Ring camera, clearly showing my red door, my porch steps, my mailbox at the curb. He said, "Does this look like a home you provide care at 3 times a week?" Tanya's eyes darted. She didn't answer. Thomas asked, "Do you have any documentation of employment? Pay stubs? A contract? A license?" Tanya's voice got small. "No," Thomas said. "What agency do you work for?" Tanya looked at David Fisher, then back at Thomas. "Independent." Thomas asked, "Where do you receive mail?" Tanya hesitated. "At home." Thomas held up the UPS store mailbox record. He said, "Is this your address?" Tanya's face went gray, and right then you could feel the judge's patience snap. Judge Bennett leaned forward and said, "Miss Mills, are you lying to this court?" Tanya started to cry. Not delicate crying, ugly crying. She said, I was told to help. I didn't think it was like this." Judge Bennett's voice went cold. "Who told you?" Tanya looked at Melissa, and if you've ever watched someone realize they're trapped by their own lies, that was the moment. Melissa's face went rigid. She didn't blink. She didn't move. Brian's head dropped like he couldn't stand to watch. Tanya said, "Melissa did. She said it was paperwork. She said it was to protect his mom." Melissa shot up out of her seat. "That's not true." Judge Bennett slammed his hand down once, not loud, but final. He said, "Sit down." Melissa sat. Denise grabbed Melissa's arm like she was trying to hold her in place. David Fisher stared at his table like it might open and swallow him. Thomas didn't gloat. He didn't even look satisfied. He looked focused. He said, "Your Honor, we move to dismiss with prejudice for fraud upon the court, and we ask for referral for investigation into attempted elder financial exploitation." That phrase hit the room like a rock. Elder financial exploitation. Now it wasn't concern. Now it was a potential crime. David Fisher stood, flustered, for the first time. He tried to argue Tanya was confused and misunderstood, which was rich, considering that was the exact thing they'd been accusing me of. Thomas handed up Melissa's Facebook post screenshots with timestamps showing her public claims about dementia while simultaneously demanding money and filing paperwork. He handed up Brian's text, "Stop this. You're humiliating us." In explaining. And then he handed up the email from David Fisher's office complaining about undue hardship from my refusal to keep paying. You could almost hear the judge thinking, asterisk, so that's what this was, asterisk. Judge Bennett took a long moment flipping through papers. He didn't rush. He didn't look at them. He looked at the evidence. Then he said, "Mr. and Mrs. Turner, stand." Brian stood slowly. Melissa stood like she was being dragged. Judge Bennett looked at them and said, "Do you understand what guardianship is?" Brian mumbled, Yes, Judge Bennett said. It removes rights. It is not a tool for family disputes or financial leverage. Melissa opened her mouth to speak, and Judge Bennett held up his hand. He said, no. One word. Done. He turned to David Fisher. Counsel, you filed an emergency petition with a fabricated witness. That is unacceptable. David tried. Your Honor, Judge Bennett cut him off. I have heard enough. Then he looked straight at me. He said, Miss Turner, I find no evidence you are incapacitated. In fact, the evidence suggests the opposite. My throat tightened. Not with sadness, with relief so sharp it almost hurt. Judge Bennett continued, the petition is denied, with prejudice. With prejudice means they couldn't just refile tomorrow because they felt like it. Then he said, I am referring this matter to the appropriate authorities for review of potential misconduct and exploitation. That's when Melissa finally cracked. She hissed, this is insane. Judge Bennett stared at her and said, what's insane is attempting to take someone's autonomy under false pretenses. Brian's shoulders slumped. Denise looked like she'd been slapped. David Fisher's face had gone pale. And me? I sat there very still, hands folded, because I didn't want them to see me shake. Not because I was scared anymore, because I was finally free. But the judge wasn't done. He asked Thomas, Counsel, do you have a request for attorney's fees? Thomas stood and said, Yes, Your Honor. Given the bad faith filing and the fabricated witness, we request fees. Judge Bennett nodded. Granted. Submit documentation. Melissa's head whipped toward David Fisher like he'd betrayed her. She mouthed, What? Denise grabbed her arm again, whispering frantic little words I couldn't hear. That fee award wasn't just money. It was the court saying out loud, Asterisk. They did wrong, and it cost you. Asterisk. Salt in the wound. Outside the courtroom, in the hallway, Melissa exploded. She tried to rush toward me, voice high, face red. She shouted, You ruined our lives. A deputy stepped in immediately, hand out, blocking her like a wall. Thomas stayed close to me, calm. I looked at her and said, You ruined your own plan. Brian didn't say a word. He just stared at the floor like it might open. Then Denise did something I didn't expect. She looked at Brian and snapped. I told you this was a bad idea. So even her mother knew. Melissa turned on Denise like a cornered animal. She said, Shut up. And the deputy said, Ma'am, you need to leave. End quote. Watching her get escorted down the hallway of the courthouse, still in her concerned wife blazer, still trying to look like the victim, was the most satisfying kind of humiliation. Not loud. Official. That afternoon, Thomas filed the paperwork for the restraining order to become longer term, based on the court's findings and the repeated contact. The judge signed off on it fast. I walked out with copies stamped and sealed. Then I went straight to the bank and moved a chunk of my savings into a new account at a different institution, because I was done trusting that anyone who'd ever been in my house couldn't find a way in. I also put a fraud alert on my credit and locked everything down again, just to be safe. I wasn't about to let them pivot to identity games because court didn't work. My peace isn't negotiable. The social fallout hit within days. Melissa deleted her Facebook posts like they'd never existed. But screenshots don't care about delete buttons. People started whispering, then they started asking, and then they started choosing sides. Eleanor told me someone at church said, I guess she wasn't confused after all. No kidding. The part that made me laugh, an actual laugh, was getting a Venmo request from Melissa 2 weeks later for $500, labeled rent help. That request sat in my notifications like a joke nobody asked for. I declined it and screenshotted it anyway, because old habits die hard. Brian didn't call. Not after court. Not after the fee order. Not after the restraining papers. He sent one text a month later, and it was short. I hope you're happy. I stared at it for a long time. Then I texted back, I'm safe. That was the truth. And it was enough. Look, I still have moments where I miss the kid he used to be. I'm not made of stone. but missing someone doesn't mean you hand them your life. I sold the pink dress. Tag still on. Donated the money to an elder abuse charity in Franklin County, and I kept the receipt for that too. That part felt like a quiet little prayer. And on a sunny Saturday, a few weeks after the case was denied, I sat on Eleanor's back porch with iced tea, watching her grandkids chase each other around the yard like the world was simple. For the first time in months, my shoulders weren't up around my ears. That's what winning looks like. If you love karma with receipts, hit subscribe. I've got more stories like this, because some people learn the hard way, and I don't mind being the lesson.